Madam President.
The senator from Iowa is recognized.
Now you hear the other side of the story. Madam President, it's a privilege for me to come to the United States Senate floor to speak on the issue of the resolution that's before us, which is a sense of the Senate resolution, which means basically the Senate is debating something that's not shooting with real bullets. In other words, it just expresses the Senate. It doesn't change any laws, so it really doesn't amount to much. As the President and congressional leaders continue to debate how best to reduce the deficit, it seems that my friends on the other side of the aisle and my President continue to demand a tax increase as part of any deal. For sure, any discussion of reducing the deficit should include a discussion of tax reform, but tax reform is different than tax increases. And you heard the previous speaker speak about Republican plans that deal with just reducing expenditures, and that's right, because we feel that the deficit problem in this country isn't because the American people are under tax, it's because Congress and Washington overspend. However, what is being discussed with this resolution currently is tax increases on targeted groups, supposedly because they can afford it. This is not tax reform. Professor Vetter of Ohio University has studied tax increases and spending for more than 2 decades. In the late 1980s, he co-authored with Lowell Galloway, also of Ohio University, a research paper for the Congressional Joint Economic Committee. That study found that every new dollar of new taxes led to more than $1 of new spending by the Congress. It didn't reduce the deficit then. You raise $1, you increase the deficit. I'll be a little more specific. Now, working with Stephen Moore of the Wall Street Journal, Professor Vetter updated that research last year and came to the same result. Specifically, Moore and Vetter found, and I quote, over the entire post-war II era through the year 2009, each dollar of new tax revenue was associated with $1.17 in new spending. That's like a dog chasing his tail. Very few dogs catch it, and so you raise $1 here. Well, the common sense might dictate it goes to the bottom line, but it doesn't work out that way. It actually increases the deficit because Congress feels, well, we got a new dollar coming in, let's spend $1.17. So history proves tax increases result in spending increases. And so we know that increasing taxes is not going to reduce the deficit. History also shows that tax increases don't increase revenues. Now that's probably contrary to most people's common sense, but I have a chart here that I think demonstrates this very clearly. And I'll be somewhat repetitive because I want to leave my remarks and just go to this chart, and I'll refer to it again. But what this chart basically shows, that over a long period of time, going back to World War II to the present, all the taxes coming into the federal government have been roughly, well, it'd come out 18.2% of gross national product, but pretty much even Steven across the board. Sometimes up a little bit, sometimes down a little bit, but for 50 or more years, averaging about 18.2% of gross national product. But what this chart also shows is, contrary to what you believe, that you raise taxes, you're going to bring in more revenue, and you reduce taxes, you're going to bring in less revenue. Well, that's not true, and this gets to this issue of taxing the wealthy, or it gets to the issue of raising taxes on anybody. So from World War II till President Jack Kennedy, we had 90% marginal tax rates. And then from President Kennedy to President Reagan, we had 70% marginal tax rates. And then in the last half of the Reagan administration and up until, well, 86 was the best, it was reduced to 50% under Reagan's administration. And then Reagan had another tax bill and it was reduced to 30%. And then, of course, you know, President Bush, the dad, made this promise in the campaign that, read my lips, no new taxes. But he didn't keep his promise, so the taxes went back up to about 40% for a period of time, until you get to a period of time when Bush the son comes into office and the marginal tax rate is reduced to where it is now, 35. But whether you have high marginal tax rates or low marginal tax rates, you get about the same amount of revenue. Now, I'm going to be repetitive on that point, but it's very important that you understand that. History shows that tax increases don't increase revenues. The chart here shows that revenues as a percentage of gross domestic product hovers around 20% as far back as post-World War II. And I said in my off-the-cuff remarks that it averaged out about 18.2%. This chart also shows where you have high and low marginal tax rates over those same years. During the last years of World War II, we had a 94% tax rate. And that was then from 1950 through 1963, it was 90%, as this chart shows. And under President Kennedy, and I want to emphasize, he was a Democrat, he was smart enough to reduce marginal tax rates to incentivize entrepreneurship. He reduced the marginal tax rates down to 70%, and it stayed around 70% until President Reagan brought it down to 50%. And let me say at this point that I just gave President Reagan credit for it, but we had some I was a brand new member of the Senate Finance Committee in 1981, and we had some very brave Democrats on that committee who felt that 70% was too high, and it's going to promote entrepreneurship more if you reduce it to 50%. Now, President Reagan gets credit for it, and I don't think any Republican on the Senate Finance Committee could take credit for it, because we would have been accused, as we've just been accused, of wanting to reduce taxes on wealthy people. So thank God there were a lot of smart, intellectually honest Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee in 1981 that said it ought to be reduced down to the 50%. Well, then it went down to 30% when we reduced marginal tax rates further during the Reagan administration. And then, as I said before, the first President Bush reneged on his promise to not raise taxes, and the marginal tax rates went back up to 40%, and it stayed there until the tax relief enacted under the second President Bush. During all of these tax increases and decreases, the amount of revenue as a percentage of GDP stayed roughly flat, 50-year average of 18.2%. So everybody thinks that if you raise the marginal tax rate, you're going to bring in more revenue. Seemingly common sense, but not true, because the taxpayers, the workers in America, the investors in this country that create jobs are smarter than we are, but we don't think they're smarter than we are. And we've had 93% marginal tax rates, 70%, 50%, 30%, back to 40%, now 35%. But regardless of that rate, we get roughly the same amount of revenue. Higher tax rates just provide incentives for taxpayers to invest, and earn money in ways that result in the least amount of taxes paid. Or you might say it this way: some people just say to themselves that they aren't going to work hard, because why should I work so darn hard if I'm going to send the money to Washington for people in Congress to spend and waste? In other words, taxpayers have decided they're going to give us politicians in Washington just so much money to spend, and it comes out about right here. We ought to have some principles of taxation that we abide by, and I abide by this principle that about 18% of the gross domestic product of our country is good enough for the government to collect and to spend. That leaves 82% in the pockets of taxpayers for them to decide how to spend, because when you send money to Washington, 535 of us deciding how to spend it, it doesn't do as much economic good or turn over as much in the economy and create jobs if it's left in the pockets of the 130-some million taxpayers individually to decide how to spend it. This benchmark of 18% of gross domestic product is good and has been consistent throughout recent history. It's a principle we should keep in mind while we debate tax code changes. This level of taxation, another reason why I say it's justified, it hasn't been harmful to the economy, as higher tax rates like we find in Europe are harmful to the economy, much higher tax rates than we have in this country. And it seems to be a level of taxation that there hasn't been a great deal of revolt by the taxpayers of America against. There's another principle I'd like to have you keep in mind, and that is, what is the purpose of tax laws? Those who support resolutions like the one we have here currently debated, this meaningless resolution, assume that the key objective of our federal government through the federal income tax laws should be to ensure that income is distributed equally throughout the country, as opposed to government taxing for the purposes of government, but not for the purposes of the redistribution of wealth. In other words, the authors of this resolution believe the federal government is the best judge of how your income should be spent. Resolutions like the one that we're considering today assume then, I say it for a second time, assume that 535 members of Congress know how to best spend the resources of this country. And presently that's about 18%, but that's not enough. Well, actually, they're spending more than 18% because the expenditures of this country add up to about 25% of the gross national product from the federal government, because we borrow 42 cents out of every dollar that we're spending today. It assumes that government creates wealth and should therefore spread it around like they do in Europe. In fact, government doesn't create wealth. Government doesn't create wealth. Government consumes wealth. Only workers and investors, laborers, and people that provide capital, and all in turn people that use their brain to invent and create, that's what creates wealth. Yet, as history shows, there is evidence that tax increases lead to more spending, and I quoted Professor Vetter, and that revenues as a percentage of gross domestic product pretty much stay the same regardless, even if the marginal tax rates are very, very high. It would be one thing for me to vote for a tax increase if it went to the bottom line, reducing the deficit. It's quite another thing to vote for a tax increase that just allows more spending and raises the deficit instead of getting the deficit down. The resolution before us now in the Senate requires us to concede, quote, that any agreement to reduce the deficit should require that those earning more than $1 million per year make a meaningful contribution to the deficit reduction effort, end of quote. The resolution does not state that such a quote unquote meaningful contribution would be accomplished through tax increases, but how else would these authors of this resolution and the taxpayers intend to or make such a contribution? Let me make clear that I do not support this resolution and will vote no on its adoption. However, I think it is a good thing that we're debating such an issue. It is clear that those who support this resolution believe that those earning more than $1 million per year are not paying their fair share. Note, however, that just last year, these very same people believe that a single person who earned $200,000 or a married couple that earned $250,000 wasn't paying their fair share. In evaluating whether people are paying their fair share, experts frequently look at whether the proposal retains or improves the progressivity of our tax system. Critics of lower tax rates continue to attempt to use distribution tables to show that tax relief proposals disproportionately benefit upper income taxpayers. We keep hearing that the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer, don't we? Almost every day here. This is not an intellectually honest statement, as it implies. What does it imply? It implies that those who were poor seem to stay poor, and that those who are rich seem to stay rich. So, I want to dispute that position. In 2007, the Department of Treasury published a report entitled Income Mobility in the United States from 1996 to 2005. The key findings of this study include, and I got some long quotes, and I won't keep saying quote unquote, but I've got about 4 or 5 paragraphs here. There was considerable income mobility of individuals in the U.S. economy during the period 96 through 2005, as over half the taxpayers moved to a different income quintile over that period. Roughly half the taxpayers who began at the bottom income quintile in 1996 moved up to a higher income group by the year 2005. Among those that were at the very highest incomes in 1996, the top 1/100th of 1%, only 25%, 1 in 4, remained in this group 10 years later in 2005. So the poor aren't always poor and the rich aren't always rich. Moreover, the median real income of these taxpayers actually declined over this period. The degree of mobility among income groups is unchanged from the prior decade, 87 through 96. So I use the group 96 through 2005, and I'm comparing it with the group 87 through 96, and so I want to repeat, the degree of mobility among income groups was unchanged over a 20-year period of time. Continuing to quote, economic growth resulted in rising incomes for most taxpayers over the period of 96 through 2005. Median income of all taxpayers increased by 24% after adjusting for inflation. The real incomes of 2/3 of all taxpayers increased over this period. In addition, the median income of those initially in the lower income groups increased. Let me start over again. In addition, the median income of those initially in the lower income groups increased more than the median income of those initially in the higher income group. Therefore, and I repeat, whoever is saying that once rich, Americans stay rich, and once poor, they stay poor, is purely mistaken. Because America is a country, a land of opportunity. Now, I want to say that the Internal Revenue Service data supports the analysis that I just gave. So I'm done quoting at that point. A study of 400 tax returns with the highest income reported over 14 years, and I don't know if these are the same 400 taxpayers that my friend on the other side just referred to in his speech, but a study of 400 tax returns with the highest incomes reported over 14 years from the year 1992 to the year 2006 shows that in any given year, on average, about 40% of the returns that were filed were not in the top 400 in any of the other 14 years. Because I got the impression that the top 400 taxpayers in the previous speech may be always the same people. But 40% were not in that group. The so-called share sacrifice resolution before the Senate now does not acknowledge these trends. Hence, I think it's intellectually dishonest. It presupposes that anyone making more than $1 million should be contributing more to reduce a deficit that they likely did not create in the first place. We created it. The resolution assumes that the folks in this income category have always made more than $1 million, that they haven't paid their dues on their way up the ladder of success, and as a result should pay a penalty for their current success even if they're on the way down the ladder. The resolution also assumes that these folks will continue earning what they're earning now. As I just noted, however, the Treasury report and the IRS tax data contradict this position. I welcome this data on this important matter for one simple reason. It sheds light on what America really is all about, what this great country is all about. Vast opportunities. And of course, as I just said in these statistics, but you can see it in a lot of different ways as well, we're a country of great economic mobility. This country built by people from all over the world. Our country truly provides unique opportunities for everyone. These opportunities include better education, health care, and financial security, and probably a lot of other things. But most importantly, our country provides people with the freedom to obtain the necessary skills to climb the economic ladder and live better lives. We are a free nation. We are a mobile nation. We are a nation of hardworking, innovative, skilled, and resilient people who like to take risks when necessary in order to succeed. We have an obligation as lawmakers to incorporate these fundamental principles into our tax system. Now, on another matter in this debate, we have also heard much about, quote unquote, closing loopholes. Well, that sounds good, and I want to tell you how I believe that ought to be done. There's things that are legal and there's things that aren't legal. Let me just say that there are, in fact, loopholes to be closed, and I would support closing them. During my tenure as chairman and then ranking member of the Finance Committee, I worked with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to cut off tax cheats at the pass. The American Jobs Creating Act, signed into law October 2004, included a sweeping package to end avoidance abuses, such as corporations claiming tax deductions for taxpayers-funded infrastructure, such as subways, sewers, and bridge leases. Corporate and individual expatriation to escape taxes, and Enron-generated tax evasion schemes. We closed them. One of the tax-avoiding provisions that the jobs bill shut down was the so-called corporate inversions. Average workers in America can't pull up stakes and move to Bermuda or set up a fancy tax shelter to avoid paying taxes. Companies that do this make a sucker out of workers and companies that stay here in this great country and pay their fair share of taxes. So that was closed. Corporate inversions, we called that. We also closed loopholes used by individual taxpayers. The Jobs Bill contained a provision that restricted the deductions for donations of used vehicles to actual sales price. Prior to that, fixed, individuals were claiming inflated fair market values before they gave their car to a nonprofit organization. Then the Pension Protection Act, which was signed into law in August 2006, I championed reforms to donations for gifts of fractional interest in art, as well as donations to charities that were controlled by the donors. Because if you give money away, it ought to be given away. You shouldn't control it after you give it away. The same way with your art. In both cases, individuals were taking huge deductions for donations without providing equivalent benefits to the charities to which they donated. In addition to ensuring that income and deductions are properly reported, I also supported giving the Internal Revenue Service more tools to go after tax cheats. The Jobs Bill contained provisions that required taxpayers to disclose to the IRS their participation in tax shelters and increased penalties for participating in such tax shelters, as well as not disclosing such participation to the IRS. I also authored the updates to the tax whistleblower provisions that were included in the Tax Relief and Health Care Act, which was signed into law December 2006. There was a whistleblower statute long before that, but because of the low dollar thresholds, it encouraged neighbors to blow a whistle on their neighbors. So our 2006 changes that I championed increased the awards for those blowing the whistle on the really big fish, individuals and businesses engaged in large dollar tax shading through complex financial transactions. Now, I don't know why it took the IRS so long to get this law underway, because they've had plenty of whistleblowers come forth, but we've only had one time so far. I think we'll get a lot of others now, but we've only had one time so far under this provision. Was made in April of this year and recovered $20 million for taxpayers that otherwise would have been lost to fraud from one company. These are just a few examples of my support for provisions to stop abuses of the tax code to make sure everyone pays their fair share. If and when we get around to considering comprehensive tax reform, I would look forward to shutting down any other abuses that exist. But first, we need to be clear on what a loophole is. Itemized deductions are just that, itemized deductions. They're not loopholes. Similarly, deductions and tax credits that enable a corporation to zero out its tax liability are not loopholes. Like, for instance, if you had a loss last year, you can carry it forward to this year. The questions of whether deductions and credits should be limited is a question that should be answered not to raise revenue, but in the context of comprehensive tax reform. Eliminating deductions and credits for certain taxpayers should be subject to extensive review and extensive debate. And taxpayers shouldn't be targeted for tax increases for political sport, as this resolution before us does. I want to finish by summing up in 3 points very quickly. First, according to this chart, tax increases don't reduce, well, not according to this chart. That's the second point I want to make. First, tax increases don't reduce deficits and they don't increase revenue as a percentage of GDP. Secondly, we ought to have some principles of taxation. And, well, first of all, this chart shows that you get about the same amount of revenue coming in over a 50-year period of time, about 18.2% of gross national product. You have high marginal tax rates, really low marginal tax rates, but it still brings in about the same amount of revenue. Second, we ought to have some principles of taxation that we abide by. Limiting revenues to the historical average of 18% of GDP should be one, while ensuring income equality should not be one. In other words, you raise revenue for the purpose of funding the functions of government, not to redistribute wealth. And last but not least, it is right to consider tax reform when discussing deficit reduction. However, the proposal put forth so far, including the current resolution, are political proposals, not reform proposals. Tax reform requires presidential leadership, and we're just now seeing that. Well, I mean, we aren't seeing it on tax reform, but we're finally seeing it on deficit reduction, but I don't think it's going to last very long. I yield the floor.